Hello and welcome to another Lit Matters. The focus of this video is the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and it's an analysis of 5 key quotations, and I'm putting it together in the hope that it will be useful for you either with an upcoming English literature exam for analysis of extracts of Jekyll and Hyde and more extended questions, or possibly if you're writing an essay on it. Okay, let's begin. So, first one. It was hellish to see, it wasn't like a man. It was like some damned juggernaut. Okay, the whole way through this video I'm going to try and pull out a number of key themes or perhaps language devices that you can relate the quotations to. So here we go. This is obviously a simile. It was like some damned juggernaut. So that's an immediate thing you can identify. And there's 2 references to hell in here. Firstly, very obviously the adjective, it was hellish to see. But also it was like some damned juggernaut. If you are damned, you are damned to hell. You are being sent for damnation, for fire and brimstone for all eternity without relief. So there's 2 references to hell. There's this sort of simmering away of these hellish imagery in the background to the presentation of Hyde, particularly at the beginning. This quotation's from Mr. Enfield, by the way, right at the start of chapter 1. There's also a supernatural theme going on here. Juggernaut was, as you can see from the pictures on the top left and the top right, comes from a Sanskrit word in India of the sort of chariot that would carry these Hindu gods through these crowds on these gigantic sort of holy days, and they would be so big and so massive that they would crush some of the worshippers, supposedly. So the reference here is to Hyde as something, you know, super powerful and out of control and destructive, a destructive force. And it also links being a juggernaut to a sort of unchristian exoticism for the Victorians. They would have had an increasing exposure to Oriental and Asian culture with the British Empire charging around the world, colonizing places and stealing all their riches and pillaging various aspects of alien other culture. And so this would be quite attractive, it would be quite exciting, but it might also be slightly frightening and fearful for the Victorians. They might see a number of aspects of this, not least Hinduism, this idea, this polytheistic religion with these many gods, as unchristian and improper and not right. So the fact that Hyde is being referred to as a link to this Hindu god sort of suggests he's exotic and unknown and different, but also not proper, not Christian. And in the Victorian mind, you know, the British Victorian white male, they were fairly secure that they'd won the life's lottery. They were British. They were British empires ruling the world. They were Christian. They were male. They were white, and that was the sort of pinnacle. And other religions or other global cultures were inferior. Okay, number 2 then. Quotation here, there is something wrong with his appearance. This is still Enfield. Something displeasing, something downright detestable. I never saw a man I so disliked, and yet I scarce know why. He must be deformed somewhere. He gives a strong feeling of deformity, although I couldn't specify the point. Okay, immediately you've got this idea of the surface, something wrong with his appearance, and the notion of superficiality, of not being able to trust what the surface is suggesting, and that there's, you know, you have to look for deeper truths or hidden depths to people and ideas. So immediately there's that level of distrust of what's on the surface. But Stevenson also then uses a number of plosives. So these are where you have sounds like but, t, d, k, that your mouth sort of blocks the sound and then releases it all in one go, sort of explodes out of your mouth. So you have this here with the displeasing, something downright detestable. I never saw a man I so disliked. It's almost as if Enfield is perhaps sort of spitting out these sentiments with this plosive language. And you've also got this sense of mystery here that is a key theme that's established at the start. Enfield can't quite put his finger on what it is that he hates so much about Hyde, but he hates him. He knows that he hates him. He can't quite put his finger on it, but he's just disgusted by the man. So not only is there this antipathy towards him, it's this confusing, mysterious, disconcerting antipathy. Alright, number 3 then of 5. This comes from a conversation between Mr. Utterson and Dr. Lanyon. Utterson goes round to Dr. Lanyon's house and he says, he's trying to find what's going on with old Jekyll. We think he's some nonsense going on with him. There's something which is not quite right. And Lanyon says, I haven't spoken to him for ages. He began to go wrong in mind. And there's a sort of sense of foreboding here that or perhaps a little clue from Stevenson there that his mentally is not the man he once was. And then there's also this hint of weird science, this sense of he's been messing around with the dark arts of a science that he shouldn't be. And they had this disagreement, this row over Jekyll's scientific experiments, and for Lanyon it's unscientific balderdash, which means rubbish, nonsense, stupidness, and he can't be doing with it. He's not interested. He doesn't want to know. There's a sort of sense coming off of Lanyon that he thinks it's kind of dangerous and not proper and wrong. Again, a sense of mystery for the audience, a sense of foreboding, but also a kind of a fear for the Victorians over the powers of science. The Victorian era, one of enormous scientific discovery, from radio to electricity to photography to television to trains and the petrol engine and all sorts of world-changing inventions and scientific discoveries, but also scary ones. This will transform their world, but that in itself is a scary process. But specifically with things like perhaps 3 key discoveries. One, the discoveries of Darwin in the origin of species, and the confirmation that we are descended from ape-like beings, okay, and we have not created all in a week like all the other animals. That rocked people's world. That changes how they see themselves, how they view themselves, their sense of their own identity, their sense of what it is to be human. That is fantastically scary for the Victorian mind. Also, the invention of dynamite, and Nobel, who was so kind of scared and shocked by his discoveries of how much he could blow up with his new invention, that he, I think, stopped doing much more research in it and donated all of his money, or the profits he made from his invention dynamite, to setting up the Nobel Peace Prize and the like. But that level of sort of science, meaning power and destructive power, that would scare people in Victorian Britain. And also perhaps discoveries of dinosaurs and fossils and geological discoveries that proved the Earth was very much older than 4,000 years, and biblical scripture was just wrong in some of those aspects, and that it also contained these weird and wonderful gigantic monsters, where they were first discovering prehistoric creatures like iguanodon and the like. So there is this sense of science being powerful and a force of an unknown power, and one that could be destructive or could be certainly very unsettling. Okay, number 4 then. Again, it's poor old Utterson who's struggling here. The figure in these 2 phases, this is where Utterson is having these dreams. He's being kept up at night by this character, Mr. Hyde. They haunt the lawyer all night, so they're haunted. Verb is relating to ghosts and the supernatural significantly, through wider labyrinths of lamplighted city, and at every street corner crush a child and leave her screaming. So he sees Hyde, this reported story he's had from Enfield, he plays it out in his dreams, and significantly he describes London as having these labyrinths, which recalls Greek mythology and Theseus and the Minotaur. The labyrinth was the labyrinth of Knossos, I think, was built by Daedalus for King Minos to contain his weird sort of bastard progeny, the half man, half bull monster, the Minotaur. And it's significant here because there's this sense of this monster lurking somewhere in the depths of London, and in a maze that you're not sure where he is, and it's kind of on his terms that the Minotaur sort of owns the labyrinth. That's his, his territory, as it were, and you're going into his territory, and it's kind of even more fearful because you're out of your element. And Theseus is the sort of the alien in that context, much like perhaps Mr. Utterson going into these dark streets and these by streets. Hyde seems like this mythological monster of unknown power and force, but it's significantly still the figure had no face. The facelessness gives him weird power in a sense because you can't pin him down. You can't. It builds on that sense of confusion that Enfield couldn't put his finger exactly on what it was that was so scary, and here this sort of facelessness gives Hyde more mystery, gives it more uncertainty, and thus more fear for others. And that famously leads into those lines where Mr. Utterson says, "If he be Mr. Hyde, I shall be Mr. Seek," and he goes and tries to track him down. But this fear of monstrosity lurking in London would be particularly fearful for a Victorian audience, and also monstrosity perhaps lurking within all of us that the whole Jekyll and Hyde novel taps into. Okay, lastly then, the 5th out of 5. In Dr. Jekyll's letter, I think back to Lanyon, he says to him, chapter 6, "You must suffer me to go my own dark way. I have brought on myself a punishment and a danger that I cannot name. If I am the chief of sinners, I am the chief of sufferers too." Okay, a couple of things. You've got this duality, the idea of two-ness in one, two opposites being contained within the one that you might be familiar with if you've read your Macbeth, that he is not just a sinner but he's the sufferer too, and is particularly kind of poignant in a way because it's quite revealing that Jekyll is Hyde and Hyde is Jekyll, that these two opposites are contained in one. But there's also perhaps a touch of vulnerability to it as well, that Jekyll is he's not all bad, as what he's trying to do perhaps for good reasons, to try and experiment with some of this science, and that this whole process is physically exhausting and draining and seemingly painful, must be enormously psychologically stressful, but also he is when he's trying to control it, but also he's exposed himself to these horrors, and sort of shouldered that responsibility, the burden of that knowledge, with his scientific discoveries. So he has, quite literally suffered in numerous ways, as well as sort of taking that responsibility on himself, that he is the sinner who has done wrong. So you've got that good and evil in there. Then you've also got a sense of liberty, that he enjoys this, or men are free to make their own choices. And Utterson says at the start that he doesn't judge his friends for the mistakes they make, and for Jekyll, he says, "You got to let me make my own mistakes. Got to go my own way." And that sort of liberty that a man or a woman has to make their own mistakes in life, and the sort of freedom that Jekyll enjoys when he's as Mr. Hyde is significant for the repressed Victorian gentleman that can't enjoy himself, and where Jekyll and Hyde is on many levels a metaphor for addiction, for perhaps drink or drugs or sex, and this lifestyle that was denied to Victorian gentlemen of a certain class. They were not expected to enjoy any of those things, but of course many of them did. There's perhaps this sense of he has to make his own mistakes in life, and he has to take the consequences of that. He has to suffer that too, and he seems to do that and accept that suffering that goes along with his sin. Okay, that's about that for 5 Jekyll and Hyde quotations. Like it or leave some comments, or subscribe to it. I hope it was of some use to you, and let me know how these could be made more useful to you. Okay, bye-bye.
Pressure. Pressure.